Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics. Today we have a very special guest on the show and one who you should all know very well by now, and it's my wonderful co-host, Ben Vagle. We have a really exciting conversation coming your way about a new book that Ben just published called Command of Commerce, America's Enduring Economic Power Advantage over China. And it relates to US-China trade relations and the economic impacts to each country from a large-scale decoupling. It's a highly relevant topic given everything that we're living through in the world of trade. And I want to get right into it. But firstly, Ben, you were on a pretty big adventure over the last few weeks, and we haven't spoken in a while. So welcome back. Do you want to just start off by telling the audience what you've been up to?
Yeah, it's been good to be back in the country. Basically, right after this book came out, I decided that I was going to give myself a bit of a break. And so I went to South America for several weeks and spent those several weeks living out of a tent in the Andes. It was a brutal, physically challenging experience, but the scenery was beautiful. So that was a nice aspect of it. Generally, though, I'm pretty relieved to be back in Washington, D.C., here on the East Coast, and I think it'll be a bit before I attempt something like that in a rural location again.
That's pretty awesome. So why don't we get started here by just talking a little bit more about your book, Command of Commerce. It's pretty rare for someone our age to have a book published already, and it's frankly pretty inspiring. So, what motivated you to do this? How did you even go about it? And, what's the main genesis of the book?
Yeah, you're right. It was definitely a busy process trying to get this book completed over the past several years, especially while also working on this podcast and doing a job. But the genesis of the book and the reason that I became so passionate about it really started at Dartmouth our senior year. I was in the thesis program in Dartmouth's government department, and I got to work with a couple of professors there who I found to be really inspiring, Ben Valentino and Stephen Brooks, and they encouraged me to write a thesis on the economic costs of a conflict between the United States and China. At that point, this was in 2021 and 2022, there was a lot of writing on what the military consequences of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would look like, but not that many people were studying this issue from an economics perspective. And so my goal was to address that quote unquote gap in the literature. And to my surprise, after constructing a bunch of economic models to look at what the cost of this kind of a conflict would be, the United States was losing much, much less than China was. US losses were still fairly high, but China's losses were anywhere between 5 and 11 times as great as those of the United States. And those findings really have, in my view, big implications for the world of policy, just because the conventional wisdom is that the US really can't sanction China without imposing harm on itself that's as great as what China would experience. And so we wanted to get those findings out into the world. And my thesis advisor, Stephen Brooks, and I decided that we were going to partner up after I graduated in order to write these findings up as a book.
That's great. It's pretty impressive and great that you continued the thesis, and it's turned into something way bigger. And so I want to talk about that more. As you said, the general consensus is that China is on the verge of overtaking the US economically. But your book challenges this piece of conventional wisdom and actually argues that the economic gap is actually still fairly wide between the two countries. So I'm curious about what the key data points are that you had which supports this argument, and what was your methodology to go about measuring it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, with the thesis, I was looking at the economic costs of a conflict between the United States and China. But as we set about converting that thesis into a book, we realized that we needed to do more analysis on what the balance of power in the world economy actually looks like. And in that regard, as you noted, the conventional wisdom is really that China's economy is on the verge of overtaking that of the United States, or maybe it even has overtaken that of the United States. For example, if you look at gross domestic product or GDP figures, China's economy is around three-quarters of the size of the United States, at least in officially reported terms, and its economy has overtaken the United States in purchasing power parity terms. So there's definitely a case to be made for China's economic strength there. And China's economy has unambiguously grown, but Professor Brooks and I think that that is missing a big part of how the world economy actually works today, which is getting at your point about what metrics we decided to focus on. One of the most important analytical lenses that we used in the book was to look at the multinational corporations and their distribution throughout the world. Production in this day and age doesn't really just occur in a single nation anymore. It's generally much more often the case that goods are produced in multiple countries at once and are ultimately assembled through globe-spanning supply chains. And multinational corporations are the entities that supervise those supply chains. And so it makes much more sense to look at who owns the multinational companies that are supervising the supply chains than to simply look at the production that's occurring within individual countries, which is what GDP looks at. And so when we use that multinational corporation lens, we basically aggregated data on all of the largest ones. There are around 2,000 of them. We found that the United States really has much more of a lead than many people conventionally think that it does. American firms generate 38% of profits globally. Chinese firms, on the other hand, generate around 16% of profits globally. And this dynamic is already pretty lopsidedly in favor of the US, but you also have to factor in American allies, which generate around 36% of profits globally. And so collectively, the US and its allies are comprising the vast majority of high-end global economic activity. And that is really pretty geopolitically significant. The other area that we looked at just in quantifying this balance of economic power in the world economy was China's economy specifically. And we found that China's economy is more than likely overestimated for a few key reasons. One of which is that the data that's coming out of China right now is generally just kind of manipulated. China has an authoritarian government and they have incentives to make themselves look as good as they possibly can. And often people in the West take the data that's coming out of China at face value rather than questioning it. So that's one reason. Another is that China's economy is really pretty weird. It's structured in a way that makes it difficult to compare to economies in the West, and that actually kind of overstates its economic power. And then the third reason is that when you look at the multinational corporations that China controls, they're generally centered in areas such as banking and construction that we don't believe are as geopolitically important as high technology industries, which is where the United States and its allies dominate. So that's a general overview of the kind of analysis that we did in the first part of the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the ideas that you talk about in your book is this idea of economic leverage and the fact that because of this dominance in key strategic sectors that have high productivity in the US, we probably have more economic leverage. I'm curious on the other side of that equation, how does China's dominance in sectors like materials and construction, which actually do play into critical global arenas like the Belt and Road Initiative, do you think that a U.S. retreat maybe from the global trading arena could potentially shift the balance of power and result in increased influence of China in some of those other economically important regions? And, how do you compare some of those top sectors to the ones in the U.S.?
These are interesting questions. And I guess just for the general context of the audience in high technology sectors specifically, the United States and its firms generate around 55% of world profits. That's a stunning share. And Chinese firms, on the other hand, generate only around 6% of global profits. It's at a level that's comparable to what's generated in Taiwan and even lags behind Japan, for example. And so China is not especially strong on this dimension. And that's important because high tech industries are very geopolitically significant. They're hard to stockpile because these industries are dynamic, they're constantly changing. And so the semiconductors that you're stockpiling now might be obsolete in a few years. And they're also bespoke. They have very unique use cases that mean that it's just hard to simply slot in high tech goods from another country if you lose access to high tech goods from a country. It's not like oil where you can simply obtain it from any country that produces it. So for those reasons, it's quite geopolitically significant that China lags behind in this area. But you are right that China is doing very, very well based off of some metrics. I think that the most important areas in which they're doing well are manufacturing and then also the banking and construction sectors that I was talking about earlier. But let's talk about manufacturing first. China makes up around 35% of the world's manufacturing value added. It's by far the world's leading manufacturer, and it also produces, ironically, a lot of high technology goods. The reason that that might work really in favor of China is that they have this ability to innovate at scale. In the United States, we're good at inventing things, but we're not as good at making things. China, on the other hand, is really damn good at making things. And so they've consistently been able to kind of surf these waves of high technology that are created in the United States, but then they scale them in a way that's hard for us to do in the States. A good example of that is solar panels. Another example of that we're seeing right now is in the electric vehicle sector. So that's why this is working in favor of China. But at the same time, a lot of the goods that are being produced in China right now are actually not owned by Chinese firms and entities. China's economy is structured such that there are a lot of American firms that are operating in China right now that are basically producing in factories that they own over there. There are also a lot of non-Chinese firms that are contracting for the firms of Americas and its allies in China. Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese firm that assembles the iPhone, is a good example of that. And then finally, China has a lot of firms that exist simply to serve Western firms and that produce in China. And for all of those reasons, China actually is pretty immensely vulnerable to a cutoff by the United States and its allies, since the US and its allies control a lot of the expertise and the purse strings that are governing how exactly China's industries work. So that's a pretty big deal. China does have these other sectors that are quite strong, however. Banking and construction are good examples of that. And in both of those cases, we found that most of the activity of these sectors are simply occurring within China. China is building a lot of apartment blocks, it's building a lot of infrastructure. These things don't really confer to it very much geopolitical leverage. I think the most salient counterpoint to that is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a really massive effort by China to build infrastructure in other countries. And you're totally right that that confers to them a pretty significant amount of geopolitical leverage. There are a lot of countries out there that are quite poor and that really depend on Chinese investment dollars and construction expertise in order to make headway on important infrastructure projects. And if we here in the United States simply turn our backs to that and turn our backs to globalization more generally, that will provide an opening for China to gain geopolitical leverage over us. But it's also something that's going to take a long time to materialize. Right now, the developing world is not, in our view, enough for China to become a geopolitically dominant player. For example, the economy of Japan, which is a staunch US ally, is larger than the economy of the entire continent of Africa. And so even if China becomes the key player in Africa, it's still going to have quite a long way to go if it wants to form a geopolitical coalition that can match what the United States has right now. So we would need to perform a lot of self-sabotage on our own end here in the US if we wanted to provide a significant opening for China to gain leverage in the international system.
That makes sense. And I want to talk next about this idea of decoupling, which you talk about in the book. We're currently seeing some signs that the US is decoupling itself from parts of the world, or at least it's showing a willingness to do so in certain sectors that are strategically important. And in your book, you try to quantify what the impact would be of a full decoupling between the US and China. So let's get into the numbers a little bit. What does a full decoupling actually mean in practice, and what would that look like for both countries?
It's a super relevant question. It's funny that you ask it. Foreign Affairs is going to publish a piece pretty shortly that features us talking about this exact same point. We spent a lot of time, as you mentioned, looking at this issue of decoupling because we wanted to understand whether the broad amount of economic power held by the US and its allies actually can translate to leverage that can affect geopolitical outcomes with respect to Beijing. And so we modeled what decoupling would look like between the US and China in the short run, so the weeks and months immediately following some kind of a conflict in response to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and then also in the long run. So looking at the long run equilibrium that the world economy would settle at following a conflict and an imposition of trade barriers. And as I mentioned at the very start of this podcast, the US sees losses that are substantially less than the ones that China experiences. China's losses are between 5 to 11 times more than those of the United States. And so, just on face, at least in the short term, it looks like a decoupling would be very bad for China. But there are some important caveats to that. The modeling that we did in order to produce those estimates assumes that the US and its allies are working together in order to cut China off economically. If the US were to just go it alone, in decoupling from China, then its losses would actually not be that much less than those of China. They would be around 70% those of China, which just is not the same level of disparity, and that doesn't confer the same level of leverage. So that's a bit unfortunate for the United States because that seems to be exactly what we've been attempting with respect to China right now. We're not really trying to enlist the support of our allies, at least as far as I can tell at the moment. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we're attempting this decoupling in peacetime. That is, we're not really doing a decoupling in response to any kind of major Chinese provocation. We're just doing it kind of for the sake of doing it because a lot of people think that trade with China has been bad for the United States. But in pursuing a decoupling on these conditions, we're going to have a harder time getting the support of our allies to inflict the maximum amount of damage possible on China. And more than that, we're throwing away a really important geopolitical tool. Because if China knows that it's going to be suffering huge economic losses in response to an invasion of Taiwan, it might be deterred from actually engaging in one. But if it is already cut off from the economy of the US or cut off from the economies of American allies, it's really going to have nothing to lose. So it's a bit unfortunate that we are pursuing this tact right now.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I guess it's a question of when you want to be using the economic leverage that you have. And so let's say that, we ultimately have some sort of decoupling and it happens in the optimal conditions where your allies are on board. What are some of the potential unintended consequences of economic decoupling that we could see in general, both in the US and other parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And in terms of the consequences that would be unintended, if we were to engage in a decoupling in peacetime, I think that the object of it would be to bring manufacturing back to the United States. That's what policymakers in DC often talk about. I noted earlier that China controls a really massive share of the world's manufacturing, and people have this idea that if we just impose tariffs on China that were high enough, some of that would come back to the States. Now, unfortunately, I don't actually think that that is true. There are a couple of reasons for that. I think the most important one is that other countries are still going to be able to manufacture more cheaply than the United States. For example, an employee in India is going to be commanding a wage that is much less than an employee in Indiana. And therefore, multinational companies are probably going to be more inclined to set up a lot of the basic manufacturing that occurs in China right now in developing countries instead. So, an unintended consequence of imposing these high tariffs on China and decoupling with it might be that manufacturing goes to countries that are non-Chinese, but not to the United States. Another unintended consequence for both Europe and the United States is really just that China might be more emboldened to act aggressively if there is no economic relationship between the United States and China. And the reason is, as I stated earlier, China is not going to have that much to lose from aggression. And if it perceives that it's going to be suffering harm that's disproportionate to what the United States and its allies would experience, it might sense a closing window of opportunity during which its power is as close as it ever will be to the US and its allies, and where it therefore should try to undertake actions to revise the international order in its favor. Some famous examples of that include Japan attacking the United States during Pearl Harbor. The reason that it did that is that the US barred oil exports to it 6 months before, and it realized that it was not going to be able to fuel its military for much longer without massive territorial expansion. And so it concluded that it had to attack the United States at that moment.
Interesting. It's a lot of game theory behind all of this. So it's interesting to think about. And as you know, Ben, I'm all about practicality. So I want to tie all of your work together into something practical. What impact do you hope that your research will have on policymakers, both in the US and potentially other countries? And additionally, what are some actionable things that business leaders who are presumably thinking about this very topic quite a bit right now can do to prepare for a potential shift in the global world order of trade?
Yeah, these are great questions. And we wrote this book with policymakers in mind. Obviously, the book does have quite a few policy implications, and a few that I'll just rattle off now, especially given that the United States seems to be contemplating a decoupling with China, are that number one, a decoupling with China in peacetime is going to be bad for the United States economically, and it's also going to be bad for American leverage. I've already spoken a bit about why that's the case. I don't think I'm going to need to go into it in more detail now, but policymakers really should have that key fact in mind. A second lesson is that America's allies are actually very, very important to the economic leverage that the United States has. They make up a really pretty large share of the world's important high technology companies. And so if the US wants to impose sanctions on China that actually have a bite and that are effective, it's going to need to enlist the support of firms in countries like Holland or Japan. So we cannot afford to ignore our allies. And it's a good reason for us to remain committed to Europe, especially because the Europeans control a really large number of the world's important companies. The third takeaway is that we are actually winning much more from globalization than many people think that we are. A lot of people in the States like to say that globalization has hollowed out our industrial base, which it has to some extent, and that therefore we need to wind back the clock and abandon globalization to bring back all of these jobs. But one of the important things that our work shows is that globalization has really significantly enhanced American economic power. Just look at the multinational corporations that we control. We account for a vast slice of the world economy, much vaster than what our GDP might suggest. And I don't think that's something that we should throw away lightly. To business leaders, though, I would say that despite how important they are to America's national power, they probably would be wise to take steps to diversify from China to some extent in the near future, just given the massive amount of geopolitical risk and turbulence that we're seeing with respect to the US and China right now. If there is a world in which the US ever sanctions China at a very large scale, they're not going to want to have all of their eggs in the China basket. And they should take steps now to lessen the potential pain that may come from that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to another podcast that talked about the same very point you made, that globalization has increased wealth across other countries quite a bit over the last decade, but the wealth increase over that same period for the US is orders of magnitude more.
Mm,
And so it's been a winning recipe on multiple fronts. So it's
instant
interesting that
favor.
you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Um, Before we wrap things up, I want to conclude with one final question. It's obviously no joke to have a book published before the age of 25 and to have international policymakers and economists alike interested in it. So, how did you manage to pull it off? And maybe what's one piece of advice that you'd have for current students in college or even young folks like myself to really do something big and hit it out of the park like you did?
I can't say that I would recommend spending a bunch of evenings over the course of 2 years trying to publish a book. It was a very taxing process in a lot of ways, but the piece of advice that I have is that writing this book ultimately proved to be worthwhile just because of how passionate I was about the underlying issues. Professor Brooks and I knew that we had important insights that it would be valuable to share. And just the act of trying to crystallize those insights and get them out into the world was really rewarding. My piece of advice is really that you should follow your passion and take that as deep as you can possibly go, because if you are truly curious and are truly excited about what you're doing, it's going to produce pretty wonderful things.
Well said. That's inspiring. Thanks a lot, Ben, for being here and for talking about this book. It's been a really eye-opening conversation for myself and hopefully for our audience too. And I'm looking forward to giving the book a full read. For those who are interested, I will link the book website in our podcast description where you can find more information about it and how you can order a copy as well if you're interested. So thanks everyone for joining us on this week of Toast and Topics. We will see you again next time where we'll discuss recent staff shortages at Newark Airport, which is in my backyard, and the difficulty in hiring air traffic controllers more broadly. We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.